Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." So has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
On March 7th, 1557, a French ship landed in Guanabara Bay near modern-day Rio de Janeiro, carrying 14 French Protestant men ready to bring the gospel to this new continent. One of them, 23-year-old Jean de la Rey, kept a detailed journal. They were just some of the early Protestant missionaries sent to many parts of the world. Stay with us to find out more in this episode of Kids Talk Church History. I'm Emma, I'm 17, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And I'm Christian. I'm 15 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
My name is Sean. I'm 13 years old and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
Some people think the early Protestant church was not concerned about missions, but that's not true. It's true that the Roman Catholics had more missionaries at this time, but that's because Protestants were busy setting up their churches around Europe and making sure their pastors were properly trained. The mission to Brazil was actually sent by John Calvin himself when a naval officer who had founded a colony there asked for missionaries. This officer knew Calvin because he had gone to school with him.
Yeah, I think many missionaries back then went out together with people who were founding colonies or looking for trade routes with other countries. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so. But there were some who went by themselves. I read about a Lutheran missionary who went to Ethiopia around the same time.
So what happened to the missionaries who went to Brazil?
That story didn't have a happy ending because after a while, the officers started to disagree with the missionaries on matters like the Lord's Supper, so they had to go back home. But while they were waiting for a ship to arrive, they moved away from the base and lived with the native people. De la Rey's account of his life with the native people is very moving. We'll post some articles about this story in the show notes.
I read that when the missionaries found a ship to take them back to France, it was old and unsafe and ended up drifting off course. When their provisions were gone, both the crew and passengers had to survive on whatever they could find on board, including boiled leather and candles made of animal fat.
Yeah, I can never even imagine boiling a leather shoe for dinner.
I guess when you're hungry, you can eat anything.
Well, not anything. De la Rey had to draw a line with cannibalism, which he condemned even for starving people.
I read a story when the Brazilian natives offered him a grilled human foot for dinner, and he got scared thinking he was going to be their next meal.
Yeah, they apparently ate some of their enemies after a battle. But he also found many things to admire in the native people. For example, their detachment from material things and their love for nature. And even if this mission was short, De la Rey's book helped many others to see that people everywhere could be reached by the gospel. For example, the native people in Brazil were very moved by Psalm 104 and La Rey's explanation.
So, who were some other missionaries around that time as well?
There were Dutch missionaries that went east as far as Taiwan. I've read about a missionary to Taiwan, Antonius Hambroek, who, besides fulfilling his pastoral duties, opened a school for boys and girls and a college for teachers. Then, after learning the local language, he helped to translate the Gospels of Matthew and John. He was eventually imprisoned and killed when a new ruler took over. And then there were people who didn't go on missions but promoted them. One of my favorites is a Dutch pastor named Peter Planicus.
That's a pretty funny name.
It's funny in the original Dutch. Pieter Platevoet, literally Peter Flatfoot.
Yes, a lot of scholars back then turned their names into Latin. I guess I'd be Shaunus.
I think it's because all the other scholars spoke Latin. We do that with English now. Even John Calvin was not his real name. He was Jean Calvin.
So, what do you exactly like about Peter Plancius?
I like that besides being a pastor, he was interested in opening new trade routes from the Netherlands to the east, knowing that missionaries could follow them too. He knew a lot about geography and cartography, so he was a pastor by day, cartographer by night. Today, he is recognized as the founding father of Dutch cartography. He reminds me of an absolute favorite of mine, Thomas Chalmers, who was a pastor and randomly also gave a series of lectures on astronomy and mathematics. I love how the Christian worldview cannot be contained to just Sunday. It must impact all aspects of life, including science.
Yeah, I think I read in somewhere that some people complain that he talked about sea voyages from even the pulpit.
I guess that can happen when you have a special interest in a subject. There's a lot more we have to say about early Protestant missions, but our knowledge is limited to a very few articles that we've read. So we should let our guest, Dr. Zach Purvis, tell us more. Dr. Purvis is professor of Church History and Theology at Edinburgh Theological Seminary. Dr. Purvis, we are so glad you agreed to join with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
You have written some articles about the Protestant missions to Brazil and the early Dutch missions. I like your titles, especially the one for Brazil, Fish and Chips. We should ask you to write a title for this episode.
I have to say, I like puns a little too much, so be careful what you ask for.
Puns are the best. So you've written about several different subjects. What caught your interest about early Protestant missions?
Yeah, good question. I suppose my interests have come from a few different places. One of them is very peculiar, I suppose, just having to do with research and writing projects. And I've been thinking for a little bit of time about whether you could tell sort of a maritime history of the Reformation via boats and water, and what sort of stories that would involve. And so that one's a bit idiosyncratic. But the other interest is really just thinking through that claim that's made all the time still, that Roman Catholics are very interested and have always been in missions, and Protestants during the Reformation cared not at all. And so I just wanted to probe deeper into that, to test that, to see whether it's true, and been able to do a little bit of work and unearth some interesting things. And so that's where it's taken me so far.
Yeah, so when the French missionaries to Brazil and the French officer argued about the Lord's Supper, as we talked about earlier, the main issue was about its meaning because the officer was still pretty much Roman Catholic on that issue. But they also discussed how to celebrate it because there was no bread or wine in Brazil. I think other missionaries had similar problems because they couldn't find bread or wine in every part of the world. Do you know what they used?
Yeah, that's right. And that's an excellent question. I think they basically used a kind of tapioca in this case, a starch that was, someone will probably have to correct me, extracted from a certain kind of plant and then milled into a flour and could be cooked one way or another. Not really a bread or a wafer, but not really broth or a soup, kind of like porridge, I suppose. So this porridge-like substance, and then water. And Calvin apparently seems to have lent some support to this, knowing that it was an irregular practice. It would have been preferable to have bread and wine. But nevertheless, they were making do with what they did have. And others, too, have addressed that question. Theodore Beza, I think, after Calvin, also addressed that issue, arguing that, again, it would be best to use bread and wine in sort of a normal or ordinary administration of the sacrament. But he didn't want people to become superstitious with regard to the elements, to turn it into a spectacle or anything like that. Calvin gives a famous line now in Book 4 of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he says basically, whether you use leavened or unleavened bread, or even red or white wine, it doesn't matter. That's indifferent. Those things are left at the church's discretion. And what he was getting at there, I think, was that fear of turning the elements into something magical, turning the sacrament into a superstitious practice. Maybe closer to some of the conversations we're having here, it's interesting to think that this discussion of what to use was one regularly raised by Reformed missionaries. And so in the 1620s, in the Dutch context, we could think about a work called the Leiden Synopsis, which was a series of theological discussions held by the theological faculty at the University of Leiden, and they produced these great statements of Reformed teaching. And as part of that, they discussed the sacrament of the Lord's Supper as a spiritual food for Christ's believers, offered through bread and wine for remembering Christ and declaring his death, for communion with Christ and his body, for increasing assurance of faith to the glory of God. And then they also went on to say that the elements are important. Christ instituted them specifically, common things taken from everyday life. And so there's a certain similarity and analogy of bread and wine to nourishment, to joy, this feast character that one has in the supper, to the body and blood of Christ and all that Christ does for us for our salvation. And then they say, if the supper is administered where bread and wine are not found or cannot be obtained, it's possible to use whatever takes the place of bread and wine or whatever might be equivalent for those peoples. And so they try to tread this line while paying close attention to the institution of the Lord's Supper, but also not turning the elements into something superstitious in themselves.
As you said in your article, the main issue was the meaning of the Lord's Supper. And the officer got so angry that he killed 3 missionaries and threatened to kill the others. That was quite an extreme reaction. But I've read those who studied in Geneva were trained to expect suffering. Can you explain why?
Yeah, that's right. Part of the training in Geneva reflects complex sort of political, social circumstances in areas around Geneva at the time, certainly in France. And part of it reflects maybe more fundamental theological concerns. Calvin, like Luther and like many others during the Reformation, had a very strong theology of the cross. So they understood that God really delights to confound the wisdom of the world, that in a real sense, the Savior took his throne, yes, in the ascension, but in another sense, even perhaps more profoundly, on the cross when he was lifted up, and that the pattern of the Christian life reflects the pattern of the Savior. Then first comes suffering, then comes glory. And so Christians, those studying in Geneva, learned this well. They learned that they were pilgrims passing through this evil age and were not to seek worldly conquest or glory, but to expect discomfort, even persecution for the faith, not things that they should seek out for its own sake, but if it should come, that they were to know that, as the New Testament tells them, blessed are you when you're insulted for your confession of Christ's name. And so they understood that, and they carried that sense of how God operates wherever they went, whether it was across the border into France for many of them, where they were martyred for the faith, or farther afield, all the way to the short-lived Genevan French Reformed mission in Brazil.
In your article about the Dutch Golden Age, you talk about a Dutch mission to Brazil. Did it have any connection with the one from Geneva?
As far as I know, and I'm by no means an expert here, but as far as I know, there is no connection between these two.
That's pretty interesting. But can you give us a little bit of background and explain what the Dutch Golden Age was and why it was important for missions?
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps it can be likened in some ways to the Pax Romana, I suppose, the peace of Rome in the early centuries. External forces which enabled the gospel to spread. And there's something similar going on here with the Dutch Golden Age and missions. First of all, it's maybe not the greatest title. Historians always tell everyone, be mindful of the fact there are no real golden ages. Every age has its warts, and they might seem foreign to us, but that's okay. The past is like a foreign country. But in any case, the Dutch Golden Age is usually described as that period from basically the end of the 16th to the end of the 17th century, when there was a Dutch Republic, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, a number of provinces that had revolted from Spanish rule to form a republic. And this act then led to really great prosperity in all manner of ways, to all kinds of achievements in the arts, the sciences. There were these great centers of learning set up. For example, the University of Leiden became a kind of powerhouse, reformed center of education. It also led to the expansion of the Navy and to control of seafaring trade routes, as you've already mentioned. And so you had the establishment in the Dutch Golden Age, then the Dutch Republic, first of the Dutch East India Trading Company in 1602, and then the West India Company in 1620, which advanced all kinds of both commercial and state interests. Really, business and empire were closely intertwined here. But this also had an advantageous and sometimes difficult connection to Protestant foreign missions as well. Another aspect to this is that the Dutch Republic became really the center of the European book trade, and it helped to disseminate all kinds of Reformed literature as far as these trading ships could carry books. And so even on board these ships, there would be multilingual hymn books, psalters in multiple languages. For singing the Psalms, there would be multilingual catechisms, often the Heidelberg Catechism. And the Reformed churches saw to it that as these companies set up really colonial outposts of one sort or another, wherever they went, that Reformed congregations would also be established as quickly as possible. Churches would be planted in these locations, and there would be a minister called and sent. There would be a body of elders, a session or consistory. There would be deacons who looked over the material, physical welfare of the people. And then back in the Dutch Republic, there were classes or sort of presbyteries, these regional bodies of churches, which did their best to exercise oversight over each of these church plants. Of course, sometimes with more diligence than others. But they were also combined then with attempts to establish local schools, to teach the catechism, to translate resources into the particular language, certainly the Bible above all, but then other secondary standards and confessional documents and catechisms and teaching aids and textbooks and so forth. And so while it was bound up with all the complex issues involved in sort of colonial imperial projects of the age, nevertheless, the gospel did go out on these trading ships, and churches were established.
Yeah, and in your article and what you were saying just before, you said that the ships going to the east carried both ordained pastors and non-ordained so-called comforters of the sick. How were they chosen, and what was their role as comforters of the sick?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of these comforters of the sick, as they were called, they traveled aboard these ships on the East and West trading companies. They were basically ministerial apprentices, I suppose, sort of candidates for pastoral ministry, who were not yet ordained, but were somewhere along the path of their training. Kind of like an intern then. And because of their ecclesiastical status here, as they're recruited, they're sent by churches and with the cooperation of the trading companies, they had significant but ultimately somewhat limited, I suppose, pastoral capacities or responsibilities. So they could lead in prayer, and they certainly would, as their name suggests, provide some measure of comfort to the sick, give some kind of instruction and counsel to those on board and those that they saw when the ships docked at port somewhere. We also know that they carried a lot of books with them. We have these sort of inventories or checklists of things that they brought with them. So they'd often travel with a Bible in Dutch or in Spanish or another language, copies of theological books in various languages. So Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, or works from William Perkins from Cambridge, or Heinrich Bullinger from Zurich. They would have copies of the Heidelberg Catechism, works from Theodore Beza and many others, and they would bring all these with them. And they also were permitted, while services were held, either on the ship, sometimes before there were ministers, or in their local contexts once they reached port, to read from printed sermons, but not preach their own. And they initially did not administer the sacraments at all or conduct marriages or other sort of functions. But eventually, and not without a little bit of controversy, there were cases, some churches permitted them to, for a time, be able to administer baptism, but not the Lord's Supper. Though that's probably a minority function here. So they had this role. They were sort of a ministerial apprentice. This was part of, you think, like a extravagant internship in some ways, where they traveled and they helped serve aboard these ships.
So you've mentioned many Dutch pastors and professors who supported missions from home like Planicus did, but I am just curious about Planicus because I think he's cool. So do you know if any of his maps survived?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know almost nothing about this, but I think here that there is at least one copy of his most famous map of the globe from 1592 in the former Roman Catholic Seminary in Valencia, Spain, the Corpus Christi College. Don't know how it got there. That would be a fascinating story, I'm sure, one worth digging into. But we have at least one extant copy, and so I'm sure there are others here or there yet to be discovered.
Now, here's the last question we ask all of our guests. How did you become interested in church history?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know. I don't know, really. I've always had an interest in history. I suppose my interest in church history really developed during my own time in seminary. I was very struck by some of the arguments, the teachers that I had, that in fact, church history is really family history. And so why would you not want to know more about the far reaches of the family tree? And so I've just carried that with me since then, I suppose.
So, Dr. Purvis, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And if you're interested in further reading about things that we talked about, there will be resources in the show notes. And we are always having giveaways, so make sure you enter on our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org. Also, we are approaching the time when all of our hosts get together and talk about what they have learned from a particular period of church history, in this case, the 17th century. And we are inviting a listener to join us. So please write and tell us why you would like to be on our podcast, and your name will be entered in this special drawing. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals and on behalf of my co-hosts, Christian and Sean, I am Emma. Thank you for listening to Kids Talk Church History.